The day a pilot defied physics to save hundreds of lives. What if I told you the most dangerous part of a World War II bombing mission wasn't the flak, the fighters, or the freezing skies over Germany? It was the Times landing asterisk. The moment the bomber crossed the English Channel, the real battle began against failing hydraulics, shredded tires, and the unbending rules of aviation. One wrong move, and the very procedure meant to save the crew would kill them. But on the 8th of March 1944, a young captain with a radical idea changed everything. This is the story of how a 6-year-old pilot broke the rules, defied physics, and invented a technique that would save hundreds of lives, all by doing the one thing flight instructors had warned him never to do. Asterisk, stalling his bomber just feet above the runway. Asterisk. It was a cold afternoon at RAF Woodbridge when Flight Lieutenant Michael Reynolds first saw it. AB-17 limped toward the emergency runway, smoke trailing from 2 engines, its landing gear twisted like a broken toy. Standard procedure called for a gentle, controlled descent, but this bomber was screaming in at 155 miles per hour, far too fast, flying level as if it would never land. Reynolds grabbed the radio, heart pounding. "Pull up, go around." But there was no reply. Then, at just 20 feet above the tarmac, the impossible happened. The pilot yanked back the throttles and hauled the yoke, deliberately stalling the 36,000-pound Fortress. For a terrifying second, the plane hung in the air before dropping like a stone, slamming onto the runway with a thunderous impact. Miraculously, it held. The crew survived, and in that moment, Reynolds realized he had just witnessed the birth of something extraordinary. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force was losing hundreds of bombers every month, not just over Germany, but times on the way home asterisk. The B-17 was a marvel of engineering, able to absorb staggering damage, yet its greatest weakness lay in the very procedure meant to bring it home safely. The long, slow approach demanded perfect control, but combat-damaged bombers had none. Hydraulics bled out mid-descent, control surfaces froze, and tires blew apart on touchdown. Between November 1943 and February 1944, RAF Woodbridge alone recorded 17 crashes during landing attempts. Men who had survived flak barrages and fighter attacks were dying because their crippled planes couldn't execute the textbook landing they'd been trained to perform. Captain Howard Slim Buie had seen enough. A combat veteran with 18 missions over Germany, he'd watched friends die not in the air, but on the ground. The problem, he realized, was the approach itself. The longer the bomber stayed in the air, the more time its damaged systems had to fail. What if, instead of fighting the inevitable, you race times toward the runway, then cut all power at the last second, letting the plane drop the final few feet in a controlled stall? It sounded insane. It looked suicidal, but it had one advantage. It reduced the critical window where things could go wrong from 90 seconds to just 15. Buie tested his theory in a battered B-17 training plane, deliberately stalling it at 20 feet above the runway. Again and again, he refined the technique, flying in hot at 140 miles per hour, cutting all 4 throttles simultaneously and pulling back on the yoke to stall the wings at the last possible moment. The landing was brutal, the impact jarring, but the bomber stayed upright. The landing gear held. And most importantly, the crew walked away. When Buie presented his method to his superiors, the reaction was immediate and fierce. Stalling an aircraft near the ground was the leading cause of aviation deaths. Every manual, every instructor, every safety regulation warned against it. But Buie stood his ground. The current procedures were killing more men than they were saving. For a damaged bomber, A hard, fast landing was better than a slow, precise one that ended in a crash. His demonstration was enough to convince his skeptical squadron commander, who agreed to let him test it further. Within weeks, the technique was being practiced across the base. The breakthrough came when Brigadier General Frederick Castle, a man who had lost 11 bombers to landing accidents, witnessed Buie's method firsthand. The general's endorsement forced the Army Air Forces to take notice. On the 19th of March 1944, Technical Order 123 was issued authorizing the power-off stall landing for emergency use at designated airfields. The technique spread like wildfire. By June, it had saved countless lives, including those of legendary pilots like Robert Rosie Rosenthal, who used it to land his badly damaged B-17 with a shredded tire and failing hydraulics. The Germans, who had assumed any bomber they hit was doomed, were stunned to see these destroyed planes still making it home. The numbers spoke for themselves. Between March and August 1944, RAF Woodbridge recorded 127 emergency landings using Buie's technique, 119 of them successful. The fatality rate for emergency landings dropped by 60%. By the war's end, an estimated 500 to 800 lives had been saved by this one simple, radical idea. Yet Buie himself remained humble. He returned to the U.S. after completing his combat tour, spending the rest of the war training new pilots in the technique he had pioneered. When he received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the citation made no mention of the regulations he had broken, only the lives he had saved. In his later years, he summed it up simply, "I just didn't want to see any more friends die in landing accidents. That's all it was." The legacy of the power-off stall landing lives on in aviation today. It's a lesson in the power of adaptation, of questioning the rules when the situation demands it. For Buie, the choice was clear. Follow the manual and let men die, or break it and save them. Sometimes, the most revolutionary ideas are born not in laboratories, but in the heat of the moment when a pilot looks death in the face and says, "Not today." And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of all.